Harper felt the weight of her routine like an unbearable burden, though she carried herself with a dignity that seemed invisible to her husband, Jacob. He treated her like a disposable accessory, a figure that existed only to maintain the illusion of a perfect life. Mornings were silent, lunches felt hollow, and nights carried a chill born from disdain. Deep down, Harper knew something was wrong, but she had no proof. Just that nagging intuition pulsating in her mind like a distant siren. That Tuesday, while picking up Jacob's clothes strewn across the sofa, she found something that froze her in place, a receipt folded into quarters. It was from a luxury boutique listing a dress that Harper had never seen, at least not in her closet. Her mind started connecting the dots. Jacob wasn't exactly subtle in his behavior. Over the past few months, he'd grown more distant, always explaining his absences with endless work meetings and corporate dinners. Harper's heart raced as suspicion turned into a grim certainty. Jacob wasn't just busy. He was betraying her trust, dishonoring what little was left of a marriage she had tried to save on her own for years. That night, Jacob came home late as usual, phone in hand, his mind somewhere else entirely. Harper watched him as he walked across the living room without even glancing at her. He seemed oblivious, lost in his thoughts. She approached him, holding the receipt between her fingers. "Jacob, can we talk?" she asked, her voice steadier than she expected. He looked at her as though she were an inconvenience. "Not now, Harper. I've got an important meeting tomorrow." "This won't take long. I just want to know why you bought this dress." She held out the receipt, and for a moment he froze. Just a split second, but it was enough for Harper to notice. Jacob had always been quick with excuses, but now he stumbled, tripping over his words. "Oh, it's for Charles's birthday. Kimberly, my colleague, needed something to stand out at the event. It was just a favor, nothing more." The excuse was flimsy, and the name Kimberly hung in the air like a silent threat. Harper pressed her lips together, fighting back the wave of anger and sadness crashing over her. "I'll go with you to this event," she said firmly. Jacob raised his eyebrows in surprise. "Harper, it's not really your kind of place. It's a corporate setting full of important people. You wouldn't feel comfortable. That's not for you to decide. I'm going." The intensity of their gaze lingered, but Jacob knew he couldn't stop her without raising more suspicion. With a heavy sigh, he nodded and left the room, leaving Harper alone with her thoughts and a heavy heart. On the night of the event, Harper got ready with care. She chose an elegant black dress, understated yet striking enough to highlight her natural beauty. As she stepped into the luxurious restaurant, she felt all eyes turned toward her. This wasn't her world, but she decided she wouldn't let it intimidate her. And then, she saw him. Jacob sat at a central table, laughing with a group of people, while Kimberly, young, attractive, and wearing the dress, stood by his side, holding his arm with an intimacy that couldn't be mistaken. Harper's blood boiled. She walked toward them slowly, every step deliberate and purposeful. Jacob noticed her and visibly tensed. Kimberly glanced at Harper, sizing her up with a disdainful look, as if she knew she had the upper hand. "So glad you could make it, honey," Jacob said with forced cheer, trying to maintain appearances. "I'm not your honey, Jacob," Harper replied, her voice sharp as glass. The table fell silent. Jacob tried to smile, but it was a nervous, unconvincing attempt. Harper took a deep breath and grabbed the microphone being used for speeches. "Good evening, everyone," she began, adrenaline coursing through her veins. "I just wanted to take a moment to thank this man here, Jacob, for showing me exactly who he is. I want you all to know that this marriage is over." Jacob tried to get up, but Harper stopped him with a cold, unwavering glare. The room was stunned, and Charles Bume, seated at another table, watched the scene unfold with curiosity. The storm inside Harper began to settle as she handed back the microphone and walked out of the restaurant. For the first time in years, she felt like she was in control of her life. Little did she know that night would mark the beginning of a transformation that would change her story forever. As Harper walked across the room with firm steps, she felt the weight of countless eyes on her back. The murmurs in the room grew louder, but none of it mattered. Each step was a release, a break from the years of humiliation she had silently endured. When she reached the restaurant door, a cold breeze hit her face, and she took a deep breath. Outside, the night seemed darker than ever, But for the first time in a long while, she could see a path ahead. Before she could hail a cab, she heard hurried footsteps behind her. It was Jacob. "Harper, wait!" he shouted, grabbing her arm tightly. She turned around, meeting his eyes with a determined stare. He looked desperate, but not remorseful. "What do you think you're doing? Are you trying to humiliate me in front of everyone?" His voice was full of anger, but Harper just let out a bitter laugh. "Humiliate you? Jacob, I just did what you've been doing to me for years. The only difference is I did it openly while you've been hiding." Jacob tried to argue, but his words seemed to wilt in the face of her conviction. "You're being irrational, Harper. You can't just throw everything away like this." "Irrational," she repeated, her tone icy. "What's irrational is thinking I'd keep putting up with your lies. I'm done, Jacob. Done being your convenience." She pulled her arm free from his grip and got into the first taxi she saw. Jacob stood frozen on the sidewalk, watching as she disappeared into the night. For the first time, it seemed he realized that the control he'd always had over her was gone. Inside the cab, Harper let her head rest against the seat. Her heart was still racing, but she wouldn't cry. Not tonight. The driver, a man with a kind face and a concerned expression, glanced at her in the rearview mirror. "Are you okay, ma'am?" he asked, his voice gentle and careful. Harper took a deep breath before answering. "I'm not sure," she admitted, "but I will be." The driver nodded, not pressing her further, and continued driving. She didn't know exactly where to go. Going back home wasn't an option. The house she shared with Jacob was a symbol of everything she wanted to leave behind. "Where should I take you?" the driver asked after a few minutes of silence. Harper hesitated before responding. "Somewhere I can think." He seemed to understand and drove her to a quiet park, where the city lights twinkled in the distance. Harper stepped out and sat on a bench, while the driver waited silently, respecting her need for space. As she stared at the nighttime skyline, Harper felt a mix of fear and relief. For the first time, she was alone with her thoughts, free from Jacob's shadow dictating what she should do or feel. The silence was uncomfortable but necessary. She pulled out her phone and typed a message to Jacob. "I'll come by tomorrow to get my things. Don't contact me again." With that, she blocked his number. It was a simple gesture, but one that carried enormous symbolic weight. When she returned to the taxi, the driver was still there, waiting patiently. "Ready to go?" he asked with a small smile. Harper nodded, feeling a flicker of gratitude. "Thank you for waiting." "Don't mention it. Sometimes you just need a moment." There was something comforting about the simplicity of their interaction. As he drove, Harper found herself thinking about the kindness of strangers. Maybe there were people in the world who wouldn't treat her the way Jacob had. When they arrived at a modest hotel, she thanked him again and stepped out of the car. As the driver pulled away, she felt a pang of loneliness but also a sense of freedom. That night, as she lay on the bed in her small room, Harper made a promise to herself. She would never again allow anyone to treat her as if she were disposable. This was the beginning of a new journey, a journey to discover who she truly was and what she deserved. The next morning, the sun seemed to shine differently, as if the world was offering her a fresh start, and she was ready to embrace it. The next morning, Harper woke up with a different feeling. The bed was unfamiliar, the room's scent wasn't comforting, but there was something liberating about the absence of the weight she carried at home with Jacob. Sitting at the small hotel table for breakfast, her thoughts wandered back to everything that had unfolded the night before. She didn't know exactly what she was going to do next, but she knew one thing: there was no turning back. Even so, the anxiety lingered like a constant shadow. How would it feel to return to that house to gather her things? How would Jacob react? Would he truly understand that she wasn't coming back? Harper knew he had a special talent for manipulation, and the thought of the confrontation ahead put her on edge. After paying for her hotel stay, she called for a taxi. As the car drove her to the house where she had spent so many years, her fingers trembled slightly, but her mind was resolute. There would be no more arguments, no room for doubt. When she arrived, she hesitated for a moment before unlocking the door with her own key. The house looked the same as always, but to Harper, it was no longer a home. It was just an empty shell, filled with bitter memories. Jacob was sitting on the couch, his phone in hand, a frustrated look on his face. When he saw Harper walk in, he immediately stood as though he'd been waiting for her. "So you're really going through with this?" he asked, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "You're going to throw everything we built away?" She met his gaze, unfazed. "What did we build, Jacob? I didn't throw anything away. You did that for both of us." He let out a nervous laugh, running a hand through his hair. "You're so dramatic, Harper. Every couple has problems. We could have worked through this." "Problems?" She shot back, stepping closer. "Problems don't include cheating, lying, and constant humiliation. Don't try to twist this into something it's not." Jacob stood silent for a moment, maybe hoping she'd falter, but Harper held her ground, walking past him toward the bedroom to start packing. Each piece of clothing she folded into her suitcase felt like one step closer to freedom. "So that's it? You're just going to run away?" he asked, standing in the doorway. "This isn't running, Jacob. It's setting myself free." She zipped the suitcase with a decisive motion. When she turned around, she saw Jacob still standing there, arms crossed, but his expression had changed. It wasn't anger or desperation. It was fear. He was losing control, and for the first time he knew it. "You're never going to find someone like me," he said, his voice laced with wounded pride. Harper met his eyes and smiled. "That's exactly what I'm counting on." She walked past him without a glance back, pulling her suitcase in one hand and holding her phone in the other. When she reached the front door, she felt a weight lift from her shoulders. She placed her keys on the entryway table and stepped out for the last time. Outside, the same taxi driver from the night before was waiting. He had given her his number in case she needed help, and she'd taken him up on the offer. It was a simple gesture, but it made her feel like she wasn't entirely alone. "Ready to go?" he asked with a kind smile. Harper nodded, tossing her suitcase into the back seat. "Yes, I'm ready." As the car pulled away, she looked at the house one last time. There were no tears, no regrets, just the certainty that this was the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. When the taxi stopped in front of a small cafe, Harper got out and invited the driver inside for coffee as a thank you. He seemed surprised but accepted. "I don't think I caught your name," she said as they sat down. "Tyler," he replied with a smile. She smiled back, feeling an odd sense of comfort. She didn't know exactly where her life was headed, but in that moment, it didn't matter. She was free, and that was all she needed to start again. As they sipped their coffee, Harper felt something she hadn't in a long time. She could simply breathe. Tyler was unlike anyone she had ever met. He had a calm demeanor that seemed to contrast with the intensity of the past few days. He didn't ask too many questions, wasn't invasively curious, and simply offered his presence, letting the silence feel comfortable. "So what's next?" he asked, after taking a long sip of his coffee. Harper looked out the window of the small cafe, watching people hurry by, each wrapped up in their own story. She didn't have an immediate answer. For years, her life had been dictated by Jacob, his schedules, his demands, his expectations. Now, without all that, the future felt both terrifying and full of possibility. "I'm still figuring that out," she admitted with a faint smile, "but I know I'm not going back." Tyler nodded, seeming to understand the weight of her words. "That's a good start." They stayed there a little longer, chatting about lighter things, the weather, the coffee, the city. Tyler shared that he was a widower raising his 6-year-old daughter, Scarlett, on his own. Scarlett loved to draw and dreamed of being an artist. Harper was captivated by the way he spoke about his daughter, with such tenderness and pride. It was such a stark contrast to Jacob, who barely knew her likes or dreams. "You know, if you need a place to stay for a few days, it's not much. But there's room at my house," Tyler said hesitantly, as if worried he might be overstepping. "No pressure. Just thought I'd put the offer out there." Harper was silent for a moment, considering it. The idea of staying with a stranger was intimidating, but there was something about Tyler that inspired trust. Besides, she didn't want to return to a cold, impersonal hotel or drain her limited funds without a clear plan. "That's very kind of you," she finally said. I think I might take you up on that, just until I figure things out." Tyler smiled, visibly relieved. "No pressure. It's just a place where you can feel safe." After finishing their coffee, Tyler drove her to his home, a cozy two-story house in a modest neighborhood. It wasn't fancy, but it felt alive. Photos of Scarlett adorned the walls, and children's drawings were taped to the refrigerator. The scent of homemade cake filled the air, stirring a sense of nostalgia in Harper. Scarlett ran to the door as soon as they entered, her messy hair bouncing as she beamed. "Daddy!" she shouted before noticing Harper. Tyler knelt to hug his daughter and then introduced them. "Scarlett, this is Harper. She'll be staying with us for a few days." Scarlett looked at Harper with wide, curious eyes before holding out her small hand. "Hi, Harper. Do you like to draw?" The question caught Harper off guard, but she smiled. "I'm not very good at it, but I'd love to learn." Scarlett grinned, seeming pleased with her answer. In the days that followed, Harper started settling into her new routine. For the first time in years, she felt like she could contribute without being exploited. She helped Tyler with household tasks, read bedtime stories to Scarlett, and slowly discovered there was something healing in the simplicity of this new life. Tyler, in turn, made sure to respect her boundaries. He didn't pry, didn't ask invasive questions. He simply let her be whoever she needed to be in the moment. But not everything was peaceful. Jacob had been calling repeatedly, leaving messages full of promises and threats. Harper ignored them, but she knew he wouldn't give up easily. Jacob wasn't the kind of man who accepted losing control. One evening, while Tyler was in the kitchen cooking dinner, Harper received another call from an unknown number. Thinking it might be important, she answered, but the voice on the other end sent a chill through her. "Harper, I hope you don't think you can run from me forever." It was Jacob. His voice was filled with fury, but there was something else, a veiled threat, as though he was ready to act. "I'm not going to argue with you, Jacob. It's over. Accept it. You think you can humiliate me and get away with it?" he growled. "You're going to regret all of this." Before she could respond, he hung up. Harper stood frozen, clutching the phone tightly, a mixture of fear and anger rising inside her. Tyler appeared in the doorway, noticing the expression on her face. "Everything okay?" he asked, concern evident in his voice. Harper tried to smile, but her voice shook slightly as she replied, "It was Jacob. He's not going to let this end easily." Tyler frowned but didn't say anything immediately. He simply placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder, a small gesture but one that made her feel safe. "Don't worry, Harper, you're not alone." Those simple words meant everything to her. Even as fear churned in her heart, she knew that for the first time someone was truly on her side. And that made all the difference. That night, as Scarlett slept peacefully in the room next door, Harper and Tyler sat quietly in the living room. The space was cozy, but the tension in the air was palpable. Harper held a cup of tea in her hands, as if the warmth of the drink could chase away the chill left by Jacob's threat lingering in her mind. Tyler, sitting in the armchair across from her, watched her carefully. He didn't want to push her, but he understood that Jacob wasn't the kind of man who would give up easily. "Do you think he'd actually do something?" Tyler asked, breaking the silence, his voice calm but firm. Harper hesitated before answering, staring into her tea as if it held the answer. "I don't know. Jacob's always liked to have control over everything. The thought of me moving on, he won't accept it easily." Tyler nodded thoughtfully. "Then we need to be prepared in case he tries something." "Prepared?" she asked, looking at him in surprise. "Yes, Harper. You don't have to face this alone. I'm here, and I'm not going to let anyone hurt you," he said, with a conviction that even surprised himself. Those words made Harper's eyes well up. It was hard for her to believe that anyone, especially someone she barely knew, would care this much about her. Jacob had always made her feel like she was worthless, like she needed him to exist. But Tyler, he was different. "Thank you, Tyler," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "You didn't have to do this, but you are anyway." "It's not something I have to do," he replied with a shrug. "That's just the right thing to do." The moment was interrupted by the buzzing of a phone. Harper glanced at the device on the coffee table. It wasn't hers, it was Tyler's. He picked it up quickly, frowning as he looked at the screen. "That's odd," he murmured. "What is it?" Harper asked, her worry mounting. "Unknown number. I don't usually get calls like this." He hesitated for a moment before answering. "Hello?" On the other end, a man's voice spoke, But Tyler stayed silent, listening. His face hardened with every word, his eyes narrowing. Finally, he replied in a serious tone, "I don't know who you are, but if you think you can intimidate me, you're mistaken." He hung up abruptly and placed the phone back on the table with a frustrated sigh. "What happened?" Harper asked, her voice filled with concern. Tyler looked at her, his expression a mix of worry and anger. "I think it was one of your ex's goons. He was asking about you." Harper's stomach sank. Jacob was really trying to find her, and now he was dragging Tyler into it. "This is my fault," she said, standing up quickly. "I shouldn't have come here. I don't want to put you or Scarlett in danger." Tyler stood too and gently but firmly placed his hands on her shoulders. "Harper, stop. This isn't your fault. Jacob's doing this because he's a small, selfish man, not because of anything you did." Harper opened her mouth to protest, but Tyler continued. "You have every right to start over without fear, and if he thinks he can threaten you, he's wrong. We'll deal with this." Tyler's unwavering conviction was like an anchor for Harper, who took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. "But what if he doesn't stop? What if it gets worse?" Tyler thought for a moment before responding. "Then we'll get help. I know some people in the police force who can guide us. I won't let this go too far." The mention of seeking help brought a wave of relief to Harper, though it was accompanied by a new worry. Jacob wasn't just controlling, he was manipulative, and he knew how to use his influence. Even so, Tyler's steady resolve made her believe, if only for a moment, that things might turn out okay. That night, Harper lay awake for a long time, her thoughts swirling in endless circles. But as she listened to the soft sounds of the house, the light footsteps of Tyler in the hallway, the calm breathing of Scarlett in the room next door, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Safety. Meanwhile, across town, Jacob sat in his makeshift home office, a dark expression on his face. Kimberly, the mistress who once adored him, now seemed distant and indifferent, scrolling on her phone while he poured himself his third whiskey of the night. "Any news?" she asked, not even bothering to look up. Jacob scoffed, gripping his glass tightly. "Not yet, but I'll find her. And when I do, she'll realize that no one walks away from me." Kimberly glanced up, a cynical smile playing on her lips. "You should focus on saving your career instead of obsessing over her." Jacob shot her a venomous look, but she just laughed, going back to her phone. He knew his life was falling apart, but the thought of Harper escaping, of living happily without him, was something he simply couldn't tolerate. Back at Tyler's house, Harper finally drifted off to sleep, unaware that the confrontation with Jacob was only just beginning. In the days that followed, Harper began adjusting to life in Tyler's house. He did everything he could to make her feel comfortable, and Scarlett quickly grew attached to her, as if they had known each other for years. Harper helped with simple tasks, like tidying up or preparing meals, and slowly, she started to feel like she was regaining control over her life. Still, the shadow of Jacob loomed constantly over her. Even though she hadn't received any direct calls from him, she knew he was working behind the scenes. The call Tyler had received the other night was proof enough. Harper couldn't help but glance over her shoulder whenever she left the house, or feel a chill run down her spine whenever a car lingered too long on their street. Tyler, noticing her unease, decided to take action to protect everyone. "Harper, I talked to a friend of mine who works in law enforcement," he said one morning over coffee. I told him a bit about the situation without going into too much detail, and he suggested we stay alert. "Did he say what I should do?" Harper asked, her worry evident. Tyler nodded. "He said that if Jacob tries anything directly, we can file for a restraining order. But in the meantime, it's important to document any attempts at contact or threats." The idea of involving the police made Harper uncomfortable. She knew Jacob was the type who could turn any action against him into fuel for his anger. But at the same time, she didn't want to keep living in fear. "I just want this to be over," she said, lowering her gaze. Tyler placed his hand over hers, offering the calm reassurance she so desperately needed. "It will be. But until then, you have me and Scarlett. We're in this together." That afternoon, as Harper helped Scarlett paint pictures in a notebook, a knock at the front door startled her. Her body tensed immediately. Tyler, who was in the kitchen, looked at her and gestured for her to stay where she was. He went to the door and opened it cautiously, positioning himself as a barrier. On the doorstep stood a short, stocky man in a cheap suit. He wore a fake smile that didn't reach his eyes and held an envelope in his hand. "Can I help you?" Tyler asked, his voice firm. "You're Tyler, right?" the man said, ignoring the wary tone. "I've got a delivery for Harper." Hearing her name, Harper stood up slowly, her heart racing. She approached the door but kept a safe distance. "What is it?" she asked, eyeing the envelope. "A gift from Jacob," the man said with a smirk. "He wants you to know he's thinking of you." Before Harper could react, Tyler grabbed the envelope from the man's hand and shut the door firmly before she could take it. "Tell Jacob he should learn to respect boundaries," Tyler said in a dry, clipped tone. The man shrugged, still wearing that infuriating grin, before turning and walking away casually. When Tyler closed the door, Harper looked at the envelope with dread. Tyler hesitated, but sensing it was better to confront it head-on, opened it. Inside was a single piece of paper and a small photograph. He handed them to Harper, whose hands trembled as she took them. The photograph was old, taken during a time when she and Jacob were still married and traveling together. It was a reminder of days she thought she had left behind, but it was the note that made her blood run cold. "You can't outrun the past. It always catches up to you." Tyler, reading over her shoulder, felt a surge of anger. He took the note from her hands and tore it into pieces before throwing it in the trash. "He's trying to manipulate you," Tyler said, his voice full of determination. "But it's not going to work." Harper took a deep breath, trying to hold back tears. It wasn't just the note, it was what it represented. Jacob was making it clear that he still had power over her, even from afar. "I can't let him keep doing this," she finally said. "I'm going to the police." Tyler nodded, immediately supporting her decision. "That's the right thing to do, and I'll go with you." At the police station, Harper recounted everything that had happened since the day she left Jacob. The officer, taking her statement, listened attentively, jotting down notes and asking questions. Tyler stayed by her side the entire time, offering the quiet support she needed. By the end, the officer explained the next steps. "We can file a report and request a restraining order. If he continues trying to contact or threaten you, this will serve as a basis for more severe legal action." Though the thought of taking legal action against Jacob was daunting, Harper knew there was no turning back. She couldn't keep living in fear. "Do whatever it takes," she said, her voice filled with renewed determination. As they left the station, Tyler draped an arm around Harper's shoulders. "You did the right thing." She looked at him, and for the first time in days, she felt like she had the strength to face whatever came next. But across town, Jacob wasn't ready to back down. He'd already heard about Harper's visit to the police, and his fury was palpable. "So she wants to play dirty," he muttered to himself, pacing in his office while Kimberly sat nearby, scrolling through her phone with a bored expression. "Fine. Let's see who wins this game." He picked up his phone and made a call. "I need you to find out where she is and do it fast." Jacob was prepared to cross any line, and Harper had no idea that the worst was yet to come. Jacob didn't give up. He intensified his pursuit of Harper, obsessed with making her pay for the humiliation he believed she had caused him. Using shady contacts, he hired men to follow Tyler and find out where Harper was staying. He wanted to remind her that he still had power over her, or at least pretend he did. One night, as Harper and Tyler were having dinner with Scarlett, they heard a noise outside the house. The sound of glass shattering was an immediate alarm. Tyler ran to check and found the windshield of his taxi completely destroyed. On the ground lay a rock with a note tied to it. "This is just the beginning." Harper froze, her heart pounding. She tried to hide her fear from Scarlett, but Tyler could see that something needed to be done immediately. "This has gone too far," Tyler said, anger evident in his voice. He grabbed his phone and called Charles Bume, Charles, who had already fired Jacob for misconduct and knew about the situation with Harper, listened carefully as Tyler explained what had happened. Charles wasn't just a powerful boss. He was someone with the resources to help. "Tyler, come to my office tomorrow. Bring Harper. We'll put an end to this once and for all," Charles said firmly. The next day, Harper and Tyler arrived at Charles Bume's luxurious office, carrying evidence of Jacob's threats. Charles, ever formal, reviewed everything carefully. After hearing the full story, he made a call to a contact in law enforcement. "Jacob has crossed the line," Charles said. "I'll make sure he's held accountable." As the conversation continued, Charles's gaze lingered on Tyler. There was something about him, something familiar, that Charles couldn't ignore. When the meeting concluded, Charles asked Tyler to stay behind. "Tyler, can I ask you a question?" Charles began thoughtfully. "You mentioned you were raised by your mother but never knew your father, correct?" Tyler furrowed his brow, unsure of where this was going. "Yes. My mom never talked much about him. All I know is that he left before I was born." Charles fell silent for a moment as though processing his thoughts. "Was your mother's name Dorothy?" he asked finally. The name made Tyler freeze. "Yep, but how do you know that?" Charles exhaled deeply, his expression a mix of regret and realization. He opened a drawer and pulled out an old photograph. It was of a young, smiling Dorothy from a time that felt long past. "Dorothy and I were in a relationship many years ago. When she got pregnant, I didn't know. My career was at its peak, and our relationship ended before she could tell me." Tyler stared at him, struggling to process what he was hearing. "You're saying that," he began, but couldn't finish. Charles nodded. "Tyler, I believe you're my son." The shock in the room was palpable. Tyler didn't know what to say, but there was something in Charles's eyes, a sincerity and genuine regret that made him believe it. "I never knew, Tyler. If I had, I would never have abandoned you or your mother." Harper, who had been listening quietly, placed a comforting hand on Tyler's shoulder. "This changes a lot," Tyler said, still trying to wrap his head around the revelation. Charles offered a faint smile. "I know I can't change the past, but I want to make up for the time we've lost. I want to help you and Scarlett the way I should have from the beginning." Meanwhile, the police acted against Jacob, using the evidence provided by Harper, including threatening messages and reports of stalking. They launched a formal investigation. In a moment of desperation, Jacob tried to confront Harper directly. One evening he showed up at Tyler's house, furious and unhinged. He shouted about how ungrateful Harper was, accusing her of ruining his life. But before he could cause any harm, the police, alerted by Charles, arrived just in time to arrest him. Jacob was charged with harassment and threats, marking the beginning of his downfall. Kimberly, who had abandoned Jacob as soon as he lost his job and status, disappeared from his life. Alone and disgraced, Jacob was left to face the consequences of his arrogance and selfish choices. With Jacob out of the picture, Harper's life took a new direction. True to his word, Charles provided Tyler and Scarlett with a fresh start. He offered Tyler a stable job and helped the family move into a larger, safer apartment. As for Harper and Tyler, their bond grew deeper. Built on trust and mutual respect, their relationship blossomed into something more. In a small, meaningful ceremony, they got married, with Charles as Tyler's best man and Scarlett as the flower girl. During the reception, Charles gave an emotional speech. "Tyler Harper, you are living proof that even the hardest paths can lead to incredible places. I'm proud to call you my son, Tyler, and I'm even prouder to see the family you and Harper are building." Harper, tears in her eyes, realized she had finally found what she never had with Jacob: true love and mutual respect. Months later, life looked completely different. Scarlett now had a loving mother figure and lived in a home filled with joy. Harper and Tyler were expecting their first child together, a symbol of their new beginning. The past had left its scars, but it no longer defined them. Together, they had overcome every obstacle and the future was finally full of promise. The lesson of their journey was clear. Self-love, courage, and the strength to start over would always be greater than any adversity.